It shouldn't be at all surprising, given their history with that city and the empire that it spawned, that the Fianna are among the few, werewolf and human alike, that do not mourn the fall of Rome. However, the empire did manage to leave behind one lasting conquest even as it declined, and that was the spread of Christianity. Beginning with the martyrdom of Saint Alban in the 3rd century in the English city that now bears his name, the British Isles found all manner of saints and martyrs popping up everywhere, even as the Romans cracked down on the new faith. Then, when Constantine the Great made Christianity legal in 313, the floodgates were well and truly opened. For the Fianna in general, and for Ireland especially, of course, the most prominent of these figures was Saint Patrick. Apart from being active in the 5th century, around the time that Western Rome fell, there is no knowledge of where he was born or even when exactly. What is known, and even then take it with a grain of salt, is that Patrick was not especially devout in his youth, but after 6 years of captivity and enslavement had a religious epiphany and dedicated himself henceforward to the work of God. He returned to Ireland, the land of his enslavement, and preached relentlessly to the Irish in spite of their initial hostility to him and his ways. Given that he is the principal patron saint of Ireland today, I think it's safe to say that the saint had the last laugh over his pagan detractors. There's this traditional narrative that the British Isles, and particularly Ireland, developed a uniquely Celtic form of Christianity that was eventually stamped out by a resurgent Roman Church. But in reality, it was less this and more the fact that regionalism was reduced as Europe transitioned from the Dark Ages to the High Middle Ages, and improvements in transportation and communication allowed the Church in Rome to maintain better contact with the most far-flung realms of Christendom. The Fianna generally don't care one way or another about Christianity, given that their religion is veneration of Gaia. And while some youngsters have a bad time of it when they're undergoing the rite of passage and experiencing the spirit world for the first time, they mostly get over it eventually, abandon whatever faith they had during their human lives, and embrace Gaia. However, the Fianna do give Christianity, and especially the early Christian monks of Ireland, one big credit. The fact that the monks, for the first time, put down the ancient history and mythology of Ireland into writing. It was sanitized and Christianized, mind you, but still. Without their efforts, a lot of the ancient stories and legends would have been lost to the human kinfolk. The Fianna would still remember, of course. Like the Druids of old, they memorize their tribe's history and pass it down from one generation to the next. But given that the litany says the veil shall not be lifted, that knowledge would not exist beyond the boundaries of their cairns. But just as the Romans were retreating and the Fianna felt that their Celtic kinfolk's fortunes might finally change for the better, the Germanic invasions happened. First, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes pretty much took over what is now England, reducing the Romano-British population to Wales and Cornwall, with Cornwall being completely absorbed by Wessex, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom that eventually became England. Some Romano-Britons in fact fled back across the Channel to the continent, specifically to what is now Brittany in France. Then, just when the Anglo-Saxons were settling down and starting to become moderately civilized, the Viking Age happened, and that was a rough time for everyone. That is, of course, unless you were Scandinavian or a Scandinavian Fenrir. The Vikings managed to successfully conquer and occupy solid chunks of the British Isles, and the Fenrir were not far behind them. But though they did manage to establish footholds in Scotland and Wales, to say nothing of the Danelaw covering half of England, although the Vikings did make inroads into Ireland, establishing cities like Dublin, Cork, and Wexford, here the Fenrir's luck ran out. Not a single cairn on the Emerald Isle did they manage to take, and the Fianna held many of their human kinfolk as hostage to ensure that they never returned. Alas, their Irish kinfolk were less successful in seeing off the Vikings, who got to enjoy at least a solid 2 centuries of raiding, plundering, and rapine. But it wasn't all bad news for the Fianna during this period, or their Celtic kinfolk, and relations with the Vikings weren't always hostile ones. In the case of the former, it was during the early Middle Ages that the Fianna finally managed to wrest Scotland from the Black Spiral dancers, wiping out as many as they could and driving the rest into hiding. Even in the modern Knights, the Scottish Fianna consider this a moment of great pride and regard themselves as tougher and stronger than most other branches of the tribe. In the case of the latter, the Bretons, led by their very first Duke Neveno, made an alliance with the Vikings in order to resist being taken over by the Franks. Unfortunately, about half a century later, the Bretons learned the hard way that it's rarely a good idea to make deals with Vikings. As the very moment that diplomatic relations between the two went sour, the Vikings decided that it might be fun to take over Brittany, which they did. Although the Bretons did eventually expel the Vikings after Duke Alan II bested them at the Battle of Trans-la-Forêt in 939, it very likely wouldn't have succeeded without help from the English and the Franks, with the latter's aid coming at the price of swearing fealty to the Frankish kings and becoming their vassals, which kind of makes the whole Breton-Norse alliance completely pointless when you think about it. At any rate, just as the domination of Rome couldn't last forever, neither could the Viking Age. As the Fianna never tire of saying about their kinfolk, one of the great problems of the past, going all the way back to Caesar's conquest of Gaul, was the fact that the Celtic tribes never united and often fought among themselves, even in the face of a foreign invader. And the same held true during the Viking Age, with kings and chieftains fighting amongst themselves just as much as they did the Norsemen. But at last, in the 11th century, a leader arose capable of uniting all of Ireland under one banner, High King Brian Boru. Under the command of Brian's son, Murchad MacBrian, the Irish decisively crushed the Vikings at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, bringing the Viking Age in Ireland to a close. But just as the power of the Get of Fenris began to wane, the Silver Fangs came back. And this time, they brought William the Conqueror and his Normans along for the ride. On the one hand, the Fangs and the Normans gave the Anglo-Saxons and their Fenrir kinfolk a good ass-kicking, something the Fianna would always appreciate. But many feared that the return of the Fangs might mean something akin to the domination that was suffered during the Roman era. Instead, the Fangs sent a delegation to Silver Tara to speak to the Ard Rí. Eventually, the two sides struck a deal. In exchange for the Fangs vowing not to claim a single scrap of Irish soil or a single Irish cairn, the Ard Rí agreed that henceforth the Fianna would not interfere in human politics, essentially allowing the Fangs' Norman kinfolk a free hand wherever they happened to be. And thus, relative peace was established between the Fianna, the Fangs, and even the Fenrir. While other tribes in small numbers would move into the Isles over the centuries, well into the modern Knights, the British Isles were defined by a three-way balance of power between these three preeminent tribes, with the Fianna dominating the Celtic regions, particularly Ireland, the Get retaining preeminence in England, while the Fangs insinuated themselves into the various noble bloodlines of Britain itself. Even at the time, it was not a popular decision. One of the immediate consequences being that the Breton Fianna had to give up nearly all of their cairns to the Fangs in exchange for their protection. And even into the modern Knights, this decision remains a subject of fierce debate within the tribe. After all, subsequent history demonstrated that letting the Anglo-Normans do as they pleased caused a lot of grief for the Celtic kinfolk of the Fianna. A century after the Norman conquest of England, the High King of Ireland at the time, whose name I will not even attempt to pronounce, deposed one of his rivals, the King of Leicester, who then appealed to William the Conqueror's great-grandson, King Henry II, for help, giving Henry the perfect excuse to invade Ireland with an English army. Henry won decisively, the last High King of Ireland abdicated, and then the Pope bestowed upon the English king the title Lord of Ireland, thus marking the beginning of centuries of English intervention and eventually rule of the Emerald Isle. It was much the same for the rest of the Fianna's Celtic kin. In the 1270s, Henry's great-grandson, Edward I Longshanks, conquered Wales. He then tried to take over Scotland, resulting in a brutal war and centuries of mutual enmity between the English and the Scots. As if that wasn't enough, the Fianna's kinfolk, it seemed, couldn't stop from fighting amongst themselves. Those Irish chieftains that had remained independent of Anglo-Norman rule continued to squabble among themselves, and shortly after Robert the Bruce bested Longshank's son Edward II at Bannockburn, Bruce's younger brother attempted to invade Ireland, only to be crushed in 1318 by forces loyal to the English king. And then, just to put the cherry on top, the middle of the 1300s came, and with it, the Black Death. This wasn't a big deal for the werewolves themselves. Their Gaia-given constitutions make them relatively immune to any disease that doesn't have some kind of supernatural force behind it. But it was especially devastating for their human kinfolk, given that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's entire population is believed to have died as a result. But the hardest hit of all were the Fae. Ever since the Iron Age had come to Europe, banality had been on the rise, making it that much harder year by year for the Fae to subsist on the glamour of human dreams. But now, with so many humans dying so quickly within a few short years, suddenly there was no longer enough dreaming to sustain them, at least not in any large numbers. To make matters worse, the various trods, or mystic pathways connecting the physical world, or the autumn realm as the Fae call it, and the dreaming began to break down. A calamity remembered ever after as the Shattering. Terrified that they would be completely cut off from the dreaming, the Fae panicked and began to depart the mortal world en masse. Naturally, the Fae nobility took pride of place in escaping, abandoning most of their commoner Fae subjects to their fate. The Shattering happened so quickly that, apart from most of the nobility, the Fae were now trapped in a world of increasing banality. Although the Fianna honored the ancient oath by giving the Fae as much shelter as they could in their cairns. Still, that was only a temporary measure at best. In the end, though, those Fae trapped in the mortal world found a solution of sorts to their plight, the so-called Changeling Way, a means by which Fae souls could incarnate into human bodies. Thus, mortal flesh would provide a barrier between the fairy soul and the constant corrosion of banality. Thus, it was the Shattering that gave birth to the various kith lineages that still exist in the modern knights. Boggans, born of the comforting dreams of home and hearth. The Clurican, born of the dreams of a good time, whether meeting a new person or having a good fight or hearing a good story. The Eshu, born of dreams of traveling to foreign places and meeting exotic peoples. The Knockers, born from dreams of technological creativity. The Piskies, born from dreams of mischief, of pulling pranks, both lighthearted and malicious. The Pukas, born of dreams of complete freedom, so free in fact that their most noteworthy characteristic is shapeshifting. The Redcaps, incarnations of aggression and hunger. The Satyrs, born of passion and desire, erotic or otherwise. The Selkies, born of dreams of tragic romance, specifically of the separated by circumstance variety. The Shi, traditional leaders of the Fae, and thus most of the ones that fled during the Shattering, born of dreams of nobility, with all the good and bad that comes with it. The Slua, which originate from dreams of creepy crawly things that go bump in the night, things that you would swear are there, but you just can't see them because it's just too dark. The sense that something is behind you, whether or not there really is something there. And finally, the Trolls, born of dreams of bravery and warlike honor. Alas, the end of the Black Plague did not mean the end of troubles for the Fianna or their kin. By this point, wolf populations were dropping sharply, making it especially hard on the lupus kinfolk. Meanwhile, in 1488, Francis II, the last independent Duke of Brittany, died, leaving behind a daughter who was forced to marry the King of France, thus bringing the duchy firmly under the direct control of the French crown. A few decades later, across the Channel, Henry VIII of England brought the Protestant Reformation to the Isles. The reign of his famous daughter, Elizabeth I, saw not only a ramping up of English authority over Ireland, but also intense religious strife between the Protestants and the Catholics. And so, yet again, the Fianna could only look on in despair as their kin fought one another. Things did not improve when Elizabeth died and her cousin, James of Scotland, succeeded to the throne. His reign saw the beginnings of the Ulster Plantation, as it came to be known, the colonization of what is now Northern Ireland by mostly Scottish Presbyterians, which only served to further inflame religious tensions in the Emerald Isle. And just when it looked like things couldn't get worse in Ireland, then came the English Civil War and Oliver Cromwell. It is the Sengoku Jidai. Besieged and surrounded by his enemies, a lord pays a group of men to see his only child to safety. But do they have the skill to ensure her safety? And can they even be trusted? For this is an age of honor and treachery, of blood and valor, of gold and steel. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at StudioBrainstorm.net. Links in the description.